Hi everyone, welcome back to Casual Watch Talk. This week, I'm joined by Ben from Ben's Watch Club. Thanks for joining me, Ben.
No worries, Sam. Yeah, we're ready here today to hopefully save some people some pain and money.
The pain and money bit is definitely part of watch collecting, so we don't want to save too many people from it because that's how you learn your lessons. But we thought we would do top 10 things for new watch collectors. Do you want to go with your first one and then I'll do one?
Here's one that I'm sure many people have kind of not exactly fallen for, but maybe invested too much time in. Instagram. Watch shopping on Instagram.
Oh, yeah.
You see, it can be a good resource. There's loads of pictures, loads of nice looking watches. There's also a shed load of fakes on the site. I'd say maybe 50% of the watches you see are fakes, at least from my experience. Loads of people flexing the watches, gets you thinking you need to spend 20 grand on a watch, and before you know it, you've ended up spending more than you ever would have wanted to. So for those trying to be responsible, it might not be the place to head.
I agree, and especially last year when we were all confined during the quarantine, or for most of it, the temptation to look on social media, it's bombarding, isn't it? The Kickstarter watches that are there, some of the fashion brands, it's hard to really judge.
It is, and at the end of the day, all these models who've been photoshopped 16 times, they're going to look good in any watch, aren't they? Just the same with the clothes. So it's, I think somewhere like even YouTube is generally more useful, to be honest, more information-based, shall we say.
Well, my one is, I'll just flip on over to eBay here. My one is eBay watches. In particular, I'm going to call out two watches here. First, I'm going to start with Indian watches sold from India that aren't Indian brands. So there are Indian brands, there's like HMT, there's a few others, there's even some new Indian micro brands. But what I'm talking about is watches that seem very cheap, but with main brand names on them. So here I've got an example of an Oris. Now, Oris never made a watch like that. You'll see them Jaeger LeCoultre on them. You'll see a lot of Citizen, a lot of Seiko, and these are Franken watches. And when I first started out watch collecting, this is a cautionary tale that I fell into. I definitely bought a few of these, and they're just a mess. They fall to bits when you first get them. If they arrive at all. Have you ever experienced these?
I have, thanks to my wife. A couple of years back, bought me I think it was birthday present, Seiko 5. As soon as I unwrapped it, unfortunately, the alarm bells were immediately ringing. Didn't look like any sort of Seiko 5 that I'd seen. Looked like it had been produced perhaps somewhere else. It was maybe a fake / Franken watch. It stopped working within about 6 days. So wasn't exactly a Seiko quality watch, whose quality control's already bad enough.
Well, also, I'll just piggyback onto this. So this is like an additional one. And I just want to point this out, is this Omega Seamaster. And what I want to say about this one is, often when you get into new watch collecting and you're searching for Omega or vintage Omega watches, oftentimes, and I just looked up at a few here, are these Seamaster Omega watches. Now, at one time, this is the type of watch that Omega made, but just a cautionary tale, you're not getting an Omega watch on the cheap, or Omega watch on the cheap here. You really have to know what you're doing to buy these, because they can be difficult to repair. If you're new into watches, you might not really understand what the descriptions are saying. So this is just another cautionary tale, is some of these high-end watches cost what they cost, and going on eBay and trying to find ones that seem like a good deal aren't necessarily always that good a deal.
Absolutely. Especially with these older watches, the purchase price, it doesn't tell the full story, does it? And it's not the whole price you may ultimately end up paying.
Yeah, and also you've got to be careful of buying a watch that has a movement in that can be serviced, because there's some brands, some vintage brands, that even though the brand is long dead, they use ETA movements or other movements where they can be serviced. Whereas there's some brands that had their own in-house movements that you essentially have to cannibalize another watch in order to repair it. So you've got to factor those things in.
Absolutely. Something else that's even worse than that, though, Sam. when you see a watch brand, you like the look of it, you haven't really heard the name before. There's a fair chance these days that they may be drop shipping. So for those of you unaware of this business model, this is where a company just comes up with a random watch brand, normally with like a really stereotypical British man's name, like Stephen Wellington or something. You might have heard where the second one was from. They got set up a store. They have these very often minimalist looking watches, but not just restricted to minimalist watches. And you think you're buying a watch from them, but what you're actually doing is inadvertently buying a watch from the likes of Alibaba, a wholesaler from China, whereby the store where you bought from has basically nothing to do with the transaction. So what happens is they have an arrangement with these wholesalers where when a customer places an order, they'll ship the watch directly from the wholesaler to you, the customer, and as a result, you'll be paying a huge markup because the store is the middleman. Instead, I'd highly recommend, if you've never heard of the brand that you're planning on buying and they haven't got like a good reputation, I'd have a quick check on the likes of AliExpress, Alibaba, type in the search bar the general style of watch that you're looking at, just do a couple of scrolls, few pages, and if you see the exact design there on the page, there's a fair chance they're drop shipping, and I've found countless examples of this. I've lobbed them on my YouTube channel before now. There was even a company called No Label Watch who tried to use that as a marketing point. The fact that they had no logos on because they were too lazy to, or too cheap, should I say, to pay the premium to have the watches private labeled. So they went for the completely clear ones, which cost less per unit.
I totally agree with you, and that's a good one as well. If you do really like the look of one of these fashion brands or a watch that you might expect to be a dropship, go on AliExpress. I bought this bracelet on AliExpress because I found it on a website and it was quite expensive, and I went on AliExpress and it takes an age for them to get to you. I think this took 60 days, but you can definitely find a bargain on there. So go on AliExpress because you can buy as a consumer. You don't have to buy 100 of them.
Yes, that's true. There's definitely a lot of fakes on the site, don't get me wrong, especially of some of these big brands. But yeah, if it's a tiny brand that you've never heard of, they seem to have only just popped up and all their watches are all on AliExpress already, then yeah, save yourself about 90% markup and just get it from there instead.
My next one is, don't feel as a new watch collector you have to paint by numbers. And what I mean by that is, if you don't like dress watches, don't feel you have to buy a dress watch. So if you don't like pilot watches, don't buy a pilot watch. There's this, I think, as you get into new watch collecting, you have to do this paint by numbers, like, well, I need a dress watch, I need a pilot's watch, I need a dive watch, I need a sports watch, I need a G-Shock for the gym. You don't worry about, just buy what you like. Don't worry about necessarily painting by numbers because you're trying to fill slots in a watch box or something along that line. That sometimes is a difficult lesson to learn, and oftentimes you end up buying a lot of watches. And I think sometimes as you're getting into collecting, that's part of the fun, is finding what you really like.
Here's one that might save you a few quids in the long run. I'm not someone that likes to hoard stuff, but it might be worth sometimes keeping onto boxes, especially of well-known brands, like the box that the watch comes in, because a lot of the time, if it's a watch that you get, you wear it for a while, but your feelings may change in like 3 or 4 years, you may stop wearing it. You can get a significant portion more of the money back if it's in the original box and with some of the packaging. Even with some of the cheap watches, this isn't just, your Rolexes and whatever. I've noticed you can maybe get like 30% more for a watch that's in the box, because I suppose for the new buyer, it's like they have more reason to believe it's legitimate and not one of those Franken watches that you mentioned earlier.
I go back and forth on this because some of the watches that watch boxes you get are ridiculous. Citizen, where you get that mini scuba tank, I still don't really understand why they do that. So I can understand why people might get rid of those because they do take up a lot of room, but I don't disagree with you. Some of the boxes I think could be do with being a bit more multifunctional. I think the best ones are where it comes wrapped in a watch roll or Breitling or something like that, where the case is a travel case as well. I think watch companies could do better at that. My next one is, this is a bit of a controversial one, I know this, but I'm going to label this as, not all homage watches are a homage to another watch. And this term gets bandied around a lot. I'll try and illustrate this because some watches are just copies of other watches, whereas other homage watches are paying respect to a design. So, Ben, I'm going to try and convince you on this one. And there's a famous Jaeger LeCoultre watch called the Deep Sea. And one of my favourite micro brands, Veja, have a watch that pays homage to that design. So it uses elements of their dial, but as you can see, the case shape is completely different. The hands are different on there as well. So it's paying respect to that classic design. And you'll see car companies use this, fashion brands use this. Whereas there's other brands, and there's many of these, but I'm going to in particular call out Steinhardt, where they just make a copy of a Rolex, but just tweak it enough. So this, for example, I would say is a copy of a root beer Rolex rather than paying any sort of respects to that design. Steinhardt's aim isn't to pay respect to a design, it's to create a watch that looks like a Rolex.
To cash in on the design.
And why is this important? Well, because once you get into watches and you understand the history of them, Rolex, particularly a very complex but very interesting brand. My motto with a lot of these things is you can fake the look of a watch, but you can't fake its history or romance or the reason why that watch in particular is an icon. So as you're getting into watches, I think that's an interesting thing to understand why certain watches are, and certain historical watches, because they are historically significant, doesn't mean that you can still appreciate them without having to own something that looks like it. There's so many unique looking watches out there, new watches, old watches that are unique across all spectrum of price ranges. You know, the Veja watch that I showed you there is below $500, but some of the Citizen watches and things like that have their own unique design language. I think that's a really interesting thing as you start watch collecting, is understanding why watches look certain ways and the history of design. And a lot of these brands get away with making watches that look like Rolex or look like Hublot because design patents are very hard to fight. The Submariner, Rolex Submariner, isn't a style of watch. It's a watch design that belongs to Rolex. So that's my next one, is homage watches.
Absolutely. I don't know many people who have spent a long time, in and around watches that still enjoy homage watches, aka, rebadged fakes, pretty much. A lot of them are, which is a shame in some cases because some of these brands, they can make excellent products, like build quality wise. However, I'm not someone who likes to wear a design that isn't even like an original design. I like something fresh personally, and I think most people listening to this probably would too in the long run. So you might be saving yourself the cash up front.
Yeah, exactly, because it's never going to have that same feel as the real thing, unfortunately.
No, I won't give you the feeling. Even more importantly, something else that's important is that specs don't always tell the whole story. Obviously, as watch lovers, especially us two as wristwatch creators, in our videos and that, we have to go through the specifications of the watch so that you guys generally have an indication of what you're buying. But specs should be just that, an indicator, like one of many things that you can take into account with a watch, because as we've both seen before, it's incredibly easy to pack really high specs into dirt cheap watches, but then you get the watch in your hands and it looks and feels awful. It's hideous watch, or it's super cheap homage, or the finishing's really rough. There's many other aspects of a watch to consider, such as the finishing, the design itself. Has that design been thought through or any time spent on it? What's the quality control like? That's one of the ones we see on some of these super cheap watches, because what good is sapphire crystal if the bracelet disintegrates and falls off the watch within 2 weeks? There's many things to consider, so don't just look at the specs and treat that as gospel as to how good the watch is, because if that was the case, we'd all be wearing Pagani design, if we were just going off paper, but we're not, because that isn't the only thing that matters, is it?
No, I totally agree with you. And there's other facets to this as well, is that there's a lot of value in the micro brand sector as well. So I would encourage people to look at that, especially some of the, like Vea I mentioned, but some of the other brands like Boulder and Phoebus, where they're using materials that you associate with higher end watches, like titanium, for example. I think it's good to understand the specs and take an objective view on things, because there's definitely some high-end watches where the specs aren't great. So it's good to have that always in the back of your mind to understand the specs. But you're right, not necessarily base your decision on what the specs of the watch are.
Absolutely, because otherwise, you'd see the likes of a Junghans on paper, if that's how you pronounce it, and those Junghans watches, they got rubbish specs, they're only using acrylic crystal, most of them. Obviously some are using nice mechanical movements or whatever, but they've still got some quartz watches that are well over £300, and then you compare that on paper to an AliExpress automatic special for 40 quid. A lot of people on paper may pick the latter as the best watch, when in fact I think when you have both in your hands, it'll be pretty obvious which one actually is better. It's just hard to describe it on a spec sheet, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And you mentioned an interesting point there, that there's brands that have mechanical and quartz movements, and I think it's not always that the mechanical version is better or a better quality watch. Oftentimes, for example, I'm wearing a Seiko that has a quartz movement in it, because I think the equivalent Seikos in this price range, the mechanical movements aren't as good as their quartz movements in my view. So don't automatically assume that mechanical is always better. I suppose that links in with your one about understanding the specs of a watch and how they're made.
Absolutely. What have you got next for us, Sam?
I've got another one here that might be poking fun at us as watch reviewers, and that is that don't assume a watch is an icon because somebody online is telling you it's an icon. Really do your research, and I'm going to use the Seiko SKX 009 and SKX 007 as an example here, because you'll see a lot of watch YouTubers, I even in the early days made videos on this watch, where they'll tell you this watch is an icon. And if an icon is a watch that was used for a purpose, or if a specialist group used them, like the military or something like that, that's what I think of an icon, or an iconic design, or a watch that moved a brand forward. I don't think that the SKX fits into that, and I'll give an example of a watch that I do think is an icon, and that is the Casio, the DW5600 range. And the reason that I think this is an icon is because not only was it a definitive moment for the Casio G-Shock line, but this watch was used by military personnel. It was extensively used for space travel. It's one of the few watches that NASA have actually authorized for space travel. So that's my one, is when somebody tells you something's an icon, do your own research.
I guess there's kind of a difference in watch being like iconic in a movie than in YouTube videos.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Because some of these is like iconic in the YouTube scene for being spoken about by YouTubers so much. I guess that isn't always the full meaning of icon.
Exactly. And in the SKX 009 has been in, as far as I'm aware, you see it in TV shows, but as far as I'm aware, it's been in one Robert Redford film that nobody's really heard of, where he's shipwrecked. So yeah, there's different things that are iconic about watches, I think. So if somebody says something's an icon, I would do your own research and then decide for yourself, because you might decide that the SKX 009 is an icon, but there's definitely watches that have served a purpose.
That's not to say it's not a good watch, though, is it, Sam?
That's
like, it's a solid watch if you can obviously get it at a good price these days. We're not saying it's a bad watch, just maybe not as iconic as some others, like an F91.
Exactly. And going back to the homage argument, there is Mark over at Long Island Watches makes a homage to the SKX 009, which has a lot better specs in it than the SKX 009 did, and the prices for those now are crazy for sure. What's your next on your list?
This one might hit close to home, Sam, as people who seem to get watches bombarded at them due to their online presence. And it's something that beginners might also find very useful to prevent you from hoarding watches, because if you start on a watch collection, especially in the affordable end of the market, you can accrue watches pretty quickly without realizing it, and before you know it, you've got so many that there's a big portion of your collection that you'll probably never touch. I know that's been the case with me in the past. Obviously, it's a bit different for us, running basically a business with these sorts of things. But if you're someone at home and you want to be a bit more maybe responsible with watches and just keep a nice lean collection, might be worth considering the one in, one out rule. So when you buy a new watch, you have to sell an old one, and then that keeps you, nice and thin down with your collection and keeping it only to stuff that you're wearing. Really, pretty simple.
Yeah, exactly. And that can feed into other things like buying at the right price. Sometimes pre-owned is a much better deal. Sometimes grey market watches like Joma Shop can offer much better value. And then maybe understanding watches that if you are going to do the one in, one out rule, that you can at least get some money back for them. It's not a brand that depreciates straight away as soon as you buy it, like Movement, for example, or Shanola, or one of the other brands where once you're taking the hit up front. And that's not necessarily to say base all of your watch buying decisions on whether a watch is going to retain its value or go up in value, because then you should only buy Rolex watches. But it's buy what you like. But if you are doing the one in, one out rule, or you think that you're going to enjoy rotating your collection of watches like I do, maybe doing a bit of research up ahead about what you could resell these watches for in future, I guess.
Absolutely, especially if you're considering, multiple different brands. Maybe there's a few you can't decide which one. Maybe that could be the deciding factor for you.
Exactly. And there's some people as well that don't that cost is no object, because they like to buy a certain type of watch, or they like vintage watches or so on. And that's the beauty of watch collecting. There's all sorts. Well, my last one here for new watch collectors is don't assume because a brand does something else well that they make watches that are good value for money. And I'm going to call out most of the fashion brands. In particular, I'm going to call out Gucci, for example. And Gucci make good clothes. I have a Gucci wallet that has lasted me forever. It was expensive to start with, but it was an investment that paid off. But I don't think I would gravitate to buying a watch from Gucci, because I think for a simple quartz watch, 1,350 here, and we talked about specs not being everything, but when it's something that is the specs blatantly don't show any sort of value in the watch, I think you have to be careful of it. And it's not just fashion brands that do this. There's other brands that have iconic names. I recently reviewed a Luminox watch where I didn't think that represented good value. But understanding that just because a brand like Gucci or Armani or so on make good other things, they don't necessarily make watches that are good value for money or that are going to last you a long time.
Absolutely. Had almost an identical experience with Fossil, believe it or not. Had a really good Fossil wallet that my wife bought me from America, funnily enough. And that's lasted me ages. Really good quality. Had a Fossil watch in for a review. I think it was late 2020. Disaster. Absolute garbage. And it's not often I'll just outright say garbage, but that was perhaps not even worth putting in a landfill. Honestly, one of the worst watches I've ever seen. And along similar lines as well, is just because a watch brand has produced really good watches in the past doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to produce good watches right now or in the future. It's worth maybe keeping tabs on it, making sure you're up to date with like reviews from as unbiased sources as you can. Because, for instance, like Fossil, when I did a recent video, I can't remember when it was to be honest, but I covered how in loads of the investor calls for the Fossil group, they actually explained that they'd been cutting costs for the last few years. So the watches were actively getting worse over time for customers, which, unless you were in the know about that before purchasing, you may not have realized. So those watches, Fossil watches might have been good in the late 90s, early 2000s, but right now they're garbage, or at least the main Fossil line is, from what I can tell. Perhaps there's some outliers, but I'm yet to see it.
This is such a good one because I live in the US and there was some iconic US brands, and a lot of those died out in the quartz crisis in the 70s and 80s. And these brands were sold off overseas and various different other markets, and those brand names are being used now to make completely different watches. So that's a really good point, is just because they did make good watches at one point, or because that brand was associated with making quality watches at one time, doesn't necessarily mean that they make that it's a similar quality, right? Or they're producing similar watches to the ones that they did in the past. That's a really good one. So what's your last one then to round us out?
Yeah, we got a bonus here. I know we said 10. I've got a last one which I think is worth throwing in as well. Yes, bonus time, and that is when you're buying one of these watches. I was going to say especially on the lower end, but it isn't necessarily always on the lower end. I typically factor in the cost of a replacement strap or bracelet, because so many watches across the board come with rubbish bracelets that are terribly finished or really tinny feeling or very uncomfortable, or straps that look terrible and feel awful on the wrist. Just factor in the cost of a replacement strap by default when you're buying a new watch, unless you already have some as a backup, because you'll only regret it otherwise. Again, you won't have expected to spend another 20 odd quid at least on a strap.
That's a great point. Or linking in with that, I'd say don't buy a watch based on the strap it comes with. So if you like the look of a watch, but you can't live with the fact it's got a green strap, leather strap, or you can't live with the fact that it's leather instead of rubber, or you would prefer it on a steel bracelet instead of the watch it comes on, don't have that being the deciding factor, because changing the strap on a watch, not only you can get a better quality watch, you completely change the look of a watch. The most stark one is putting a watch on a NATO, gives it a completely different look. So don't sort of confine yourself into thinking about, oh, I don't like that watch because of the strap it comes on, because that actually is the easiest thing to swap out. And not only that, take that strap off that it comes with and never wear it, then you're going to increase your resale value likely as well.
Oh, yes. And look at that. That's a perfect way to tie it up, Sam.
All right. Well, this was our top tips for new watch collectors. Let us know over on the Facebook group, on the Discord, or in the comments section down below if you've got any tips, whether you agree with us, whether you disagreed with us. Ben, thanks for joining me this week.
No problem, Sam. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, check out Ben's channel, Ben's Watch Club, and we'll see you next time on Casual Watch Talk. Thanks, guys. Bye.